Mother of Peace. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Chapter 2, Part 8. Worlds divide at the 38th parallel. You came here to see your mother? The guard asked this question as a formality. He knew why I was there, because I came every day. Yes, sir, I would respond in my soft voice. Wait here, he would say, in a fatherly tone. I'll call her for you. Would you like a candy? In 1948, when the oppression of religions by North Korea's Communist Party was at its height, my mother and grandmother were imprisoned for nearly 2 weeks for being members of the Inside the Womb Church. I was 5 years old at the time, and I would go to the prison to see my mother. The guards were nice to me because I was polite and well-behaved. Even those ruthless communists gave me fruit or candy when they saw me. I cannot explain why the authorities released both of them, as the party was increasing its suppression of religious activities. Perhaps it was out of their concern for me. The good result was that the imprisonment convinced my grandmother that to live a peaceful life, let alone a life of faith, they had to go to South Korea. Since Heo Ho-bin was still in prison, my mother was of two minds about it, but grandmother persuaded her to go. If we stay here, she reasoned, we will die before we meet the Lord. Once we are in South Korea and have met up with Soon-jong, the right way will appear. The mention of her younger brother, my uncle Hong Soon-jong, who was preparing to be a medical practitioner in the South, swayed my mother. She mounted a last protest as she gave in. How can we go there with no destination? We don't even have a place to stay. Grandmother took a deep breath and said firmly, we still must go. God will protect us. My grandfather did not join us. Like many, he had received the revelation that Pyongyang was the Palace of Eden, and he was determined to remain there to guard it. Nonetheless, he encouraged his wife and daughter to leave for the South. Because her purpose in life was to meet the Lord at the Second Advent in Pyongyang, my mother had to pray for several days and nights before finally agreeing to go to South Korea, and she went on the condition that it would be temporary. As good luck would have it, we received the news that Uncle Soon-jong had completed his studies in Japan and in Seoul, and had then joined the South Korean army. My uncle was an intellectual and a dapper young man. Moreover, he was very strong-minded. My grandmother missed her only son and wished very much to see him. In addition, she wanted to protect me, her granddaughter, at all costs. She wanted to prevent my being taken by the cruel communists and made to suffer at their hands. She was sincere when she told me repeatedly over the years, you are God's true daughter. Her mission in life was to protect me from the misfortunes of the world. Along with most people in the North, my family believed that North Korea's Communist Party would not last long. We expected that after a short stay in South Korea, we would see the downfall of the communists and be able to return home. As history shows, this dream was not to be realized. After we crossed the 38th parallel, we never considered returning to the North. Looking back, I believe that God worked through my grandmother's affectionate heart for her son and granddaughter. After all, a mother's parental heart reflects God's motherly heart. It is dark now, my mother whispered. Let's go. It was the autumn of 1948, and we left our home in the middle of the night, my mother carrying me on her back and my grandmother carrying a couple of bundles. It is quite a distance from Anju to the 38th parallel, 200 kilometers, 125 miles, as the crow flies. We had to walk for days and days to cover that distance. And we took every step on that journey with anxiety, fearing for our lives. At night we slept in empty houses, and when the morning dew fell we would start again. Our shoes were flimsy and the roads were rough, and so our feet ached from the very start. What was hardest to endure was the hunger. We would knock on the doors of shabby cottages and give them something from our bundles in exchange for food, which was usually a cup of boiled barley and rice. Undergoing such hardships, we walked and walked endlessly southward. The communists had plowed the fields and broken up the shoulders of roads to make the journey even more difficult. Our feet sank into mud as we walked through the fields, and we shivered all over with cold. Still, we continued on, looking only at the starlight. North Korean People's Army soldiers were blocking the 38th parallel, and they easily captured my mother, grandmother, and me. They locked us up in a shed, together with other frightened people who had the same intention as us. The soldiers were rough with the men, but they did not treat women and children harshly. One day, one of the adults asked me to take food to the soldiers standing watch. Though my heart trembled inside, I forced a smile and handed the food to the soldiers. After I had done so several times, the soldiers' hearts softened, and one night they set my family free. They instructed us to return to our hometown, and we walked out of their sight in that direction. And then, as we stood at the crossroads between life and death, night fell, and we waited, and heaven sent a young man to guide us on the path of life. Under the cover of darkness, we followed him across the 38th parallel. As we crossed, I was so happy that I said to Mother, "We don't have to sing songs praising Kim Il-sung anymore, do we? I will sing a song from the southern part of Korea." This too was God's intervention, for on the South Korean side soldiers also were keeping a strict watch. I sang a few lines of the song with a joyous heart. At that moment, we heard a rustling in the bushes in front of us. We were surprised and stood frozen in place, fearful that we would be captured by North Korean soldiers once again. Soldiers emerged from the bushes, South Koreans. At the sight of them, we almost wilted in relief. Those South Korean soldiers told us that they had heard us as we approached and had been about to fire upon us. When they heard the voice of a child singing, they had lowered their weapons. They welcomed us and comforted us. One soldier said, "It must have been difficult for you to make it all the way here with this beautiful young child. This isn't much, but please take it." We were so grateful to this soldier, whom God moved to give us money, enough to get us to Seoul. Looking back, if I had not sung at that moment, those young soldiers probably would have mistaken us for North Korean soldiers and shot us dead. In this way, once again, God protected us. We arrived safely in South Korea after undergoing hardships such as these. Yet, in making that journey, we parted from my grandfather, whom we never saw again. South Korea was a strange place to us. Having never been to Seoul, we had no idea how we could survive, and we were getting lost constantly. We also had lost the moorings of our faith. The hope to meet the returning Lord was indeed floating in the clouds. We had no money and no skills by which to make a living. We camped in a shabby, empty house and barely made it through each day. All we could do was talk to people. Our most urgent task was to find my maternal uncle Soon-jung. He was the only person we could depend on in South Korea, and we were hoping he was somewhere in Seoul. My mother pleaded in prayer, "What should I do to find my younger brother?" She prayed most earnestly every day to find her brother on whom she could rely. We devoted ourselves to this search by visiting clinics and pharmacies. Then we received an unexpected blessing from God. We met a man on the street who turned out to be a friend of my uncle's. This was indeed God's providential help. His friend told us that Uncle Soon-jung was serving at the army headquarters in Seoul's Yongsan district. After returning from Japan, he had graduated from the College of Pharmacy in Seoul and then received training as a pharmaceutical officer in the Korea Military Academy. He was currently serving as a first lieutenant. This kind man took us to Yongsan, and what a reunion it was. Soon-jung was delighted to see his mother, sister and niece. He had no idea of the conditions in the north and was so distressed to hear of what we had gone through to get to Seoul. He immediately rented a small room for us in Haekangdong. Our life in the south soon stabilized. I entered Haekang Primary School and, in the free land of South Korea, began going to school for the first time. I loved going to school with my bag of books every day. The older residents of the neighborhood would pat me on the head, and the neighborhood children also liked me very much. Looking back, I find it interesting that our rented room was close to Chongpadong, the neighborhood in which, 7 years later, we would end our search for the Lord at the Second Advent. Until that day arrived, however, we endured many twists and turns on our odyssey. While at Haekangdong, we heard the news that Jeong Sok-chun, the eldest son of the founder of the Holy Lord Church, had settled in South Korea. We took it as a miracle and prayed that God would guide us to meet him. All in all, we praised God that my uncle was serving as an army officer and that Jeong Sok-chun's family from the Holy Lord Church had come to the south. Without doubt, Our heavenly parent prepared a path to protect the one called to serve humankind as the only begotten daughter, the one to whom he would entrust the providence. Now that our physical pilgrimage had reached an oasis, it was time to renew our spiritual pilgrimage. The end of Chapter 2, Part 8. Worlds divide at the 38th parallel. Mother of Peace. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Chapter 2, Part 9. A blue flash of death. It was early on a hot summer morning. Red balsam flowers blossomed on one side of our courtyard, and thick, old willow and sycamore trees stood along the street. I was 7 years old, but I remember the moment clearly, as a frantic neighbor burst into our living room with the words, "War has broken out. The North Korean army has broken the line of defense across the 38th parallel." Apprehensive residents gathered in the alley in groups of 2 and 3. I had been getting used to settled life in the South, but when the North Korean People's Army launched their invasion, our short respite was over. Everyone was frightened, government reports mingled with rumors, and no one knew for sure what was going on. What happened was that the South Korean interim government packed up and moved to the city of Daejeon, 90 miles to the south of Seoul. The government ordered the South Korean army to blow up the Han River Bridge, the only bridge across the Han River on the south side of Seoul. They expected North Korean troops to arrive in Seoul soon, and they had no means to protect the city. Their strategy was to prevent the Communist army from crossing the river. They could do little or nothing to help the city's residents, who were crying out for Seoul's defense. 2 days later, my mother woke up at dawn and began packing our clothes in a bundle. Awakened by the rustling noise, I kept my eyes shut and listened to her conversation with my grandmother. "We have to seek refuge," my mother said. "After the communists get here, they'll kill us." "I know they are bad," my grandmother responded, "but do you think they would treat women harshly? If they find out we have escaped from the north," my mother reasoned, "they probably will kill us on the spot." On the evening of June 27, 1950, under a gentle summer rain, Seoul residents streamed out of the city's ancient neighborhoods. The more they realized that they were not the only ones seeking to escape, and that they all had to cross the same bridge, the more serious and desperate they became. This was war. My grandmother, mother and I joined the exodus with our bundle, following the throng moving toward the Han River Bridge. When its dim shape appeared in the dark, something told me to stop, and I grabbed my grandmother's skirt. She stopped in her tracks, and my mother turned and asked her, "Mother, what's wrong?" Grandmother looked up at the sky and then glanced down at me. Then she turned her head again in the direction of our house. "Soon-jong may come," she said with a steady tone, speaking of her son, my uncle. It seemed senseless to turn around when everyone else was fleeing the city, but she was firm. "Let's go back in case he does." My mother understood. The 3 of us made our way back home, fighting the crowds. When we got home, I spread out my blanket and lay down to sleep, but it was not long before I was awakened by the noise of a 3/4-ton truck. Its headlights illuminated our room as the door suddenly burst open. There was my uncle in his military uniform. My grandmother and mother gasped sighs of relief and hope. I thought to myself, "We can leave now," and felt at ease. "Hurry," he barked. "We have to move now." Uncle Soon-jong, based in the army headquarters as a military medic, was aware of the progress of the war. As soon as he heard that the South Korean army was preparing to destroy the Han River Bridge, he requisitioned a truck and sped to our home, knowing his family was in danger. He left the truck with its engine running in our foggy alley. We climbed in with our already packed bundle, and he drove toward the bridge. In the pre-dawn hours, crowds of refugees were swarming there from all directions, creating total chaos. We moved forward at a snail's pace on the congested street. As an army officer, my uncle had the official pass necessary to take a vehicle across the bridge. Honking the horn, he inched the truck through the crowd. Held in my mother's arms, I clung to her and gazed at the people fleeing their homes, their fear and confusion increasing by the minute. As soon as we had crossed the bridge, my uncle shouted, "Get down in your seats." As I squeezed down on the floor at my mother's feet, a huge explosion behind us shook our truck. There was a blue flash and a deafening sound. My uncle set the emergency brake and turned off the engine. Together we jumped out of the truck and clambered down into the ditch at the side of the road. I turned my face to the bridge and witnessed the next explosion. I saw a light like a demon's burning eyes piercing the night. Countless civilians as well as soldiers and policemen who were crossing the bridge were thrown about like plastic toys, flying everywhere, cast into the river below. A few meters had measured the distance between life and death. Our lives had been spared. I closed my eyes, and many thoughts flashed across my mind. Why would anyone start a war? Why do innocent people die? Why is God permitting such pain and suffering? Who can bring an end to this madness? I could not conceive of any answers. When I reopened my eyes, I saw that the bridge was cut in half. The military had accomplished its mission, at the cost of hundreds of lives. What remained amid the corpses, the screaming wounded, and the dazed survivors, was an ugly skeleton of steel, smoldering in the dark. The bombing of the Han River Bridge took place at 3 a.m. on June 28, 1950. Even though the South Korean government had announced that it would defend Seoul, it blew up the only bridge leading to safety, even before the North Korean People's Army came into the city. Hundreds of people, fleeing the city, were killed. Amid this desperate crisis, through the help of my uncle, my life and the lives of my family were preserved. At that critical moment, God guided me and protected us from danger. Even today, whenever I cross a bridge over the Han River, I see that blue flash and hear people's agonized screams echoing as if they still are burning in hell. My heart aches at the sound. At a young age, I directly witnessed the horror of war and experienced the wretched life of a refugee. The simple and innocent were killed like flies. Children who had lost their parents were crying and wandering in the streets. I was only 7, but I became so serious that war has to vanish forever from this world. It took place 70 years ago, but my throat still tightens when I recall the night the Han River Bridge fell. Left by my uncle, who had to return to military duty, barely able to keep ourselves in one piece, my grandmother, mother, and I walked on unfamiliar paths heading south. Once in a while we got a ride in a passing car. Presenting a document as to my uncle's position as a medic, we finally gained shelter in a refugee camp for military families. As the tide of the war shifted, on September 28 we returned to Seoul. The South Korean military had driven out the communists and reconstructed a passable bridge across the river. We lodged in an empty house, one that the soldiers from the north had occupied, to which the owners did not return. Then the tide of war turned again. 500,000 communist Chinese troops invaded Korea across the Amrock River. On January 4, 1951, the South Korean army again abandoned Seoul, and we again had to escape. This time we were able to board a train for the families of soldiers, and we safely arrived in the city of Daegu. The day-after-day sights and sounds of our year-long wilderness course from the north to the south defy description. I saw countless dead bodies, adults, children, victims of freezing, starvation, disease and battle. My family and I also teetered on the brink of death, but somehow, throughout this journey for survival, I felt God was with us. There was a greater power protecting our family as we escaped the north and found refuge in the south. Heavenly Parent gave me more than a sense of meaning and value. He provided me with a scale by which to measure my purpose in life. The end of Chapter 2 Part 9 A Blue Flash of Death. Mother of Peace. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Chapter 2 Part 10. The Way of God's Will. By God's hand, on our way to Daegu we met Jung Sok-chun, a member of the Holy Lord Church, to which my family had belonged in Kulsan. He was very pleased to see us, and we all felt as if we were meeting long-lost relatives. The Holy Lord Church was the church in which my parents were married, and Jung Sok-chun's mother, Kim Seung-do, was its founder. She was one of many female church leaders in the northern part of Korea whose devotion to Jesus was unparalleled and who had received revelations of what was to come. The Holy Lord Church had withered due to Japanese persecution, and the Communist Party's brutal oppression had put an end to it and all churches in the north. Escaping to the south, Jeong Sok-chun continued to worship God. With scattered Holy Lord Church members who had found each other, he created a prayer group in Daegu. He maintained his ardor to accomplish God's will and prepared himself to meet the returning Lord. He also worked diligently and had a good livelihood managing mining, rice and oil businesses. Mr. Jeong organized our lodging in Daegu. My mother made a simple request of him. When we were in North Korea, she said, we received much grace through Mrs. Hyo Ho-bin, and there were great works. Mr. Jeong knew of Reverend Hyo, whose congregation had prepared food and clothes for Jesus, as well as for the second coming Lord. As the Lord will return to Korea soon, my mother said to Mr. Jeong, please, let us pray very hard to welcome him. One morning, during the Daegu group's intense prayer, my mother received a revelation from heaven. God told her that she had to live a life of greater devotion if she wanted to meet the Lord at the second advent. Prayer alone is not enough, she was told. You have to eat your food uncooked. My mother began to subsist on pine needles, which would have been digestible had they been steamed, but she ate them raw, even though they badly damaged her teeth. My mother had come from a relatively well-to-do family. Her father had owned a large farm, and her mother had a sewing machine shop, so they were able to pay for my mother and her brother to attend high school. My maternal grandfather always taught my mother, no matter how hard things may be, you must never be indebted to others. Abiding by his words, there in Daegu my mother opened a small shop, thinking that it would provide enough money to enable her to re-enroll her only daughter in elementary school. Daily subsistence of 2 meals of kimchi broth, raw pine needle tips and peanuts, plus taking care of her shop, exhausted my mother's physical frame. A normal person would have eased off that discipline, but for my mother, her mind only became clearer. When I saw her serene countenance, while feeling sympathy for her, I could not help but be amazed. How can she run a business while consuming so little? I asked myself. It is nothing less than a miracle. My mother maintained a near-starvation diet, and her shop did not bring a profit for 3 months. Most people would have given up, but her faith was deep and, with supreme confidence that she was upholding God's dream, she persevered unconditionally. She did not compromise with reality. With the Holy Spirit, she created her own reality. No matter her plight, my mother surrendered her mind to her search for Jesus. Now, as I began to mature, she added to that the task of providing her daughter a spiritually safe environment. She wanted me to reach maturity in an environment of internal and external purity, and she considered how to separate me as much as possible from the influence of the secular world. I was attending Daegu Elementary School in a neighborhood called Bongsan-dong. As time passed, not only my face but also my bearing became attractive. I was good at my studies, so I soon became popular among my friends, and I was well liked by many adults as well. One afternoon, I was playing alone on the narrow street in front of the shop, with my mother inside. A Buddhist monk walked by, and I caught his eye and he stopped. I returned his gaze, and I remember his piercing eyes. My mother came out and bowed politely to him. Pointing to me, he asked, "Is she your daughter?" Hearing her affirmative answer, his eyes turned warm and deep. As I turned to look at my mother, the holy man spoke. "You live with only one daughter, but don't envy someone who has 10 sons. Please raise her well. This daughter of yours is going to be married at a young age. Her future husband may be older than she is, but he'll be a great man with outstanding ability that transcends the sea, the land and the skies." My mother took the ascetic's words seriously. Acting on her intention to rear her only daughter in the most serene and secure surroundings, in 1954 my mother moved us to Jeju Island off the southern coast of the Korean peninsula, to the town of Sogripo. She wanted to leave the crowded city streets and allow me to mature in the pristine countryside. We spent our first 9 months on Jeju with the family of Jeong Suk-jin, the younger brother of our Holy Lord Church friend, Jeong Sok-chun. On Jeju, as she had everywhere, my mother led me on the path of sainthood for the Lord, with no thought of worldly matters, and this fit my emerging personality very well. I read biographies of saintly women and devoted myself to the ideal of complete purity in preparation to receive my calling as the daughter of God. Once settled in Sogwipo, I enrolled in Shinhyo Elementary School as a 5th grader. At the age of 11, while my classmates were running around and playing, I lived a rigorous and strict life of faith. With my grandmother and mother, I devoted myself to prayer, study and worship. My mother soaked flattened barley in water and added it to radish kimchi for her raw food diet, while I ate millet porridge. Even though weak due to nutritional privation, when she saw farmers working the barley fields, my mother could not resist helping with the plowing. If she saw someone having difficulty carrying a load, she would volunteer to carry it for them. Without her saying a word, people were filled with admiration. "I've never met such a thoughtful person," one village woman would say to another, who would respond, "That's what I'm saying. I heard she's a regular churchgoer, but still, she is so different from the others." My mother lived the exemplary life of an authentically religious person, always putting her faith into practice by helping others. She studied the Bible and shared with me the teachings of the Holy Lord Church and the inside-the-womb church, that Jesus would return as a man in the flesh, just as he had come 2,000 years ago, that he would find his holy bride and hold the marriage supper of the Lamb, as the Bible prophesies, and that all this would take place in Korea. From her I learned the meaning of Jesus' second advent and could imagine it and taste and touch it. And from my mother, I learned the meaning of true discipleship. My uncle, who had rescued us at the outbreak of the Korean War, married at the end of that war, and grandmother Jo went to live with him and his new bride in Seoul. Within a few months, she was longing to see her daughter and granddaughter, and she came to visit us on Jeju Island. While she was with us, my uncle was posted to the city of Chuncheon, some 50 miles northeast of Seoul. He sent us an abrupt but clear message: "Please wrap up your life on Jeju and move to Chuncheon." Grandmother Jo urged us to comply, saying softly, with the pleading eyes of a loving matriarch, "My only pleasure in life is to have Hak-ja nearby and take care of her every day." That was it. In February 1955 we all three departed Jeju, bound for Chuncheon. My mother rented a small room for us in the Yaksa-dong neighborhood, and my grandmother lived with my uncle's family nearby. I enrolled in Bonggi Elementary School and soon entered the 6th grade. On the school grounds stood a big sycamore tree, its circumference greater than I could reach around. I read books under its abundant shade in the hot weather. There was a coal briquette factory next to the school, and my shoes would be covered with black soot when I walked past. All this springs out fresh in my memory. In the next year, 1956, I graduated from elementary school. I was 13 and received my graduation certificate after having attended 4 different schools. Though I had been a student at Bonggi but 1 year, I was honored at the graduation ceremony with an award for doing well in my studies. God finally responded to my mother's ceaseless prayers and pleadings. His care for her once again was extended through Jeong Sok-chun, our friend from the Holy Lord Church. Mr. Jeong remembered the last words of his late mother, the Holy Lord Church founder, Reverend Kim Sung-do. If someone fails to accomplish what God has entrusted him to do, his mother had said to him, it must be accomplished through someone else. The group to which the Lord is coming will be accused and slandered as a sex cult. Its members will be persecuted and imprisoned. If you hear of such a church, know that it may be the true church, and that you should personally investigate it and decide for yourself. So Mr. Jeong diligently traveled the country to participate in revival meetings. He did not find what he was looking for until May 1955, when he read in the Dong A Ilbo, a Seoul newspaper, about an incident at Yule Women's University. 5 Yule professors had been fired from the faculty for joining a group called the Unification Church, led by a man they called Teacher Moon, and 14 students had been expelled from the same school for the same reason. Sensing the spirit of his prophetic mother, Mr. Jeong sent a letter with the newspaper clipping to his older sister in Busan. His sister took a look at the clipping and, without thinking twice, booked passage to Seoul with her daughter. They arrived and found their way to the Jangcheong-dong headquarters of the Unification Church, but were unable to meet its leader at that time. The members told her the location of the Unification Church in Busan, and she returned home. From there, she informed her younger brother what had happened and that there was another Unification Church branch in Daegu. Jeong Sok-chun visited the church in Daegu, listened to Divine Principle lectures, accepted its teachings and joined. Then out of the blue, 10 days later, the local group was sent reeling. On July 4th, Teacher Moon and several of our church members were incarcerated at Sodaemun prison in Seoul. Mr. Jeong traveled to Seoul to visit Teacher Moon in prison. In that visit he received inspiration and encouragement. Mr. Jeong knew that he had found the one whom Jesus had sent. Some 3 months later, on October 4th, Teacher Moon was acquitted of all the charges for which he had been imprisoned. At that point, Mr. Jeong secured his family support in Daegu and moved to Seoul to devote himself full-time to God's will. After his release from Sodaemun, Teacher Moon visited Daegu. At that time, I was 12 years old, living with my family in Chuncheon, several hours north of Daegu. One morning, my mother told me that she had a dream of cuddling a white dragon in her arms. She did not know what the white dragon symbolized, nor what it meant to cradle it in her arms, but she said that something earth-shaking was about to transpire. That very day she received a letter from Mr. Jeong about his meeting the Divine Principle movement, and meeting Teacher Moon in prison, and who Teacher Moon is, and that Teacher Moon was in Daegu. My mother left for Daegu immediately, only to find that Teacher Moon had returned to Seoul. My mother felt deep regret, and while staying overnight in Daegu she had another dream. In it she saw a pair of golden dragons prostrating themselves in the direction of Seoul. With this vision carved into her heart, she took the train to Seoul the next morning and proceeded to the Unification Movement's newly purchased headquarters church in Cheongpa-dong. It was early in December 1955. There, she met the teacher of the Unification Church for the first time. The moment she greeted him, she realized that the white dragon in her dream represented none other than him, and that he was the one she had been seeking. She was deeply moved to meet, in her lifetime on earth, the Lord at the Second Advent, for whom she had suffered and sacrificed for 3 decades. She stayed at Cheongpa-dong to study the principle, and heard teachings that put together what she had learned in the Holy Lord Church and inside the Womb Church. With each lecture, her eyes were opened and her initial inspiration was confirmed. At times she pondered the meaning of her dream of the pair of golden dragons. Not coming up with anything, she put that out of her mind. Despite my mother's admiration of him, and in contrast to his affectionate openness with everyone else, Teacher Moon related to my mother in a formal and reserved fashion. As a result, she felt empty and a little bit isolated, with a feeling of lack of love lodging in her heart. She invested in prayer silently, without rest, erasing from her soul all the concepts and expectations she may have had about whom she was going to meet. Then one Sunday, Teacher Moon preached a sermon about the heart of Jesus. He said, "The people of Israel did not welcome Jesus, who came as their true Father. They allowed him to die on the cross, and asked the congregation, 'Do you know how great was the sin they committed?'" Upon hearing this, my mother withdrew into a corner of the church. There she wept, crying her heart out for the remainder of the service. Teacher Moon viewed this, and after the service he called to my mother and consoled her, saying, "A person anointed by God must pass the test of Satan as well as that of heaven." At that, like the snow melting in springtime, all sorrow disappeared from my mother's heart. Her faith in God became stronger than it ever was. Soon thereafter, she returned to Chuncheon to commence pioneer work for the Unification Church. The end of Chapter 2 Part 10. The Way of God's Will.